I'm going to tell you something that happened to me 20 years ago, and I've never put it anywhere public because saying it out loud sounds exactly like what it sounds like. And I know that. I know I sound like someone who either spent 3 days alone in the woods and hallucinated a thing, or I'm the kind of person who needs attention badly enough to invent a story that sounds impossible. I get it. But the object I'm holding is real. It exists. I own it. It's a thick metal tag, the size of a poker chip, hung on a piece of paracord that's been through enough weather to have a permanent curve in it. The surface is scored with marks, parallel grooves, old scarring from something with claws or teeth. The kind of damage you can feel when you run your finger across it. The kind of damage that takes intent and force and repeated application to achieve. There's an etching on the reverse side, a name and a date. Not a name I gave it, a name that was put there before I ever found the cub. Before I ever knew that such a thing could exist in the world and still not be known. Before I understood what it meant to be seen by something that lived underneath the surface of normal wildlife and normal possibility. 20 years is a long time to carry something like this. 20 years is a long time to know something that you can't tell anyone without immediately creating a barrier between yourself and every person you try to tell. And I'm telling you now because the situation has changed. Because the things I've been observing for 2 decades are no longer isolated incidents. Because thousands of people are now seeing what I saw. And because keeping quiet has become harder than speaking, even knowing that speaking will mark me as unreliable in the eyes of people who depend on a world that makes sense within the boundaries of the documented science. The tag is old. That part matters. The corrosion on the back edge suggests it's been exposed to weather for years, probably decades before I ever found it. The metal is brass, or some brass-like alloy, worn smooth in places where hands have held it repeatedly. Scored rough in other places where something with significant bite force has repeatedly marked it. 4 parallel gouges on one section, 7 parallel gouges on another section, 13 on another, patterns that were intentional, that were redone over time, that were layered on top of older markings until the surface looked like a record of something, a history written in claw marks and time. I don't wear the tag anymore. I wore it for years, kept it visible under my shirt collar during wilderness work, during hikes, during the routine moments of life where nobody would notice or care about a single piece of brass hanging from paracord. But around 2019, I stopped, because I realized that wearing it was an advertisement, a signal, a way of saying to anything in the forest that was looking for marked people, I'm here, I'm watching, I remember. And I wasn't sure anymore if that was safe, if that was wise, if that was something I wanted to continue inviting into my life. The story I'm about to tell you is the truth as I've experienced it, not the truth as it fits into categories of plausibility or documented animal behavior, not the truth as it aligns with what we think we know about intelligence and evolution, and what belongs in the world and what doesn't. Just the truth of what happened to me, what I saw, what I found, what I've carried for 20 years. Make of it what you will. Before we get into it, let me know where you're watching from, and if you've had an encounter like this. I was 32 years old and working timber management for a private forestry company in the Pacific Northwest. Late October, the middle of the season, and the work was the kind that eats your body in different pieces every week. By October, you've been doing this work since spring, and your hands have permanent calluses, and your back has learned to move in specific ways to manage repeated strain, and your mind has developed a kind of automaticity that comes from doing the same task so many times that your conscious brain can step back and just let your body work. My name doesn't matter for this. The location does, so I'll say it was Eastern Oregon near the Umatilla National Forest, the kind of country where the trees go up so thick that the afternoon light comes down in shafts like somebody had cut them through the canopy with a blade, and the rest is deep shadow that even in the middle of the day never quite gets bright. The Umatilla country in October has a specific quality that you can't get anywhere else and can't adequately describe to someone who hasn't been in it. The mornings are cold in a way that settles into your joints and reminds you that you've been doing physical work for 7 months, and your body has accumulated the kind of debt that doesn't get paid until winter arrives, and you're no longer moving through steep terrain 8 hours a day. The cold in October is different from February cold. It's not the numbing cold that makes you slow and careful and aware of hypothermia risk. It's the cold that makes you feel alive. The cold that makes every breath something you notice. The cold that strips the air of the heaviness of summer and replaces it with something clean and sharp and demanding of your attention. That morning, I remember the particular quality of the light. There's a specific way that morning light in late October moves through a conifer forest, the angle of it, the way it falls in narrow shafts through gaps into the canopy, and the way those shafts illuminate the moisture still hanging in the air from the previous night's temperature differential. Mist in the shafts of light, burning off as the morning progressed, the forest gradually warming and drying out, while the deep shadows in the understory remained cold and dark and smelling of wet earth and old root systems and the particular mineral sourness of water, moving under decomposed forest floor material. I had been to this site dozens of times that season. I knew its specific geography, the way the terrain lifted and dropped, the particular stands of old growth that were exempt from thinning because of their age and their value as wildlife habitat, the areas where the thinning would improve fire resistance by reducing ladder fuels. I knew this forest the way you know a place when you've walked through it hundreds of times with your eyes and your ears and your body engaged, when you've mapped it with your feet. There is a kind of meditation that happens in the forest when you've been doing this work long enough. Your body does what it does. Your eyes scan for what they scan for. Your legs carry you at the pace they carry you, and your mind goes somewhere else, not asleep, not disengaged. The deep background of consciousness that doesn't make lists or solve problems or plan for the future. The deep quiet that comes when you stop performing your life and just exist inside it. I was in that state when I saw the cub. That part matters. It matters because I've wondered, in the 2 decades since, whether that meditative attention opened something in my perception that ordinary conscious engagement would have filtered out. I was present, fully present, moving through space that I knew well, my body doing its work without requiring my conscious supervision, my attention open and broad and unfocused in the specific way that makes you capable of noticing things that focused attention misses. And then the thing under the tree was there, and I saw it without any buffer between me and what I was seeing. No initial classification that would have made my brain say, bear cub, known thing, file it, and move on. Just the raw sensory fact of the animal, landing on my perception before my categorization systems had a chance to process it. I'm glad for that. The fact that I saw it first and categorized it second is the reason I stopped, the reason I stayed, the reason I'm telling you this story instead of a different one. I was alone that day doing perimeter work on a site we'd flagged for thinning, walking the boundary lines, marking hazard trees, keeping notes on slope stability. All of it the kind of work that requires attention, but not concentration. The kind of work that lets your mind wander while your body does what it's trained to do. I'd done this exact job 500 times, maybe more. The work was automatic by then. You walk a line, you stop at markers, you assess trees for height and lean and disease and insect damage. You make marks with paint or flagging tape. You record coordinates. You move on to the next point. 8 hours of this if you're working a full day. 6 or 7 hours if you're working half day. The routine was so established that I could do it in a kind of semi-conscious state, moving through the forest like I was part of it, not like I was an intruder documenting what I found. The cub was lying on its side on the ground about a mile in from the road access, positioned partially under a fallen ponderosa that had probably been down for 3 or 4 years based on the decomposition. The bark was mostly gone, the wood was soft, and the thing was being slowly incorporated back into the forest floor, the way all fallen trees eventually get incorporated. The cub was breathing but completely motionless. I almost didn't see it at first because the color threw me off. The fur was a dark rust brown, with a gray undercoat visible where the light caught it at certain angles. Not the usual gray-black I would expect from a black bear cub. Not the black and cinnamon pattern of a black bear mother's coloring, something entirely different from anything I had reference for in my 16 years of working in the Pacific Northwest forests. I know what bear cubs look like. I've seen cubs ranging from newborns, pink and hairless and completely vulnerable, photographed in den surveys I participated in early in my career, to full yearlings approaching independence, gangly and enormous relative to the tiny things they started as. I've seen the full developmental range. I know the smell of them. The particular musk of juvenile bears that's different from adult musk, sweeter and less territorial. I know the sounds they make, the mewing and the huffing, and the deep-chested vocalizations that develop as they grow. I know how they move, the shuffling gait that looks clumsy, but covers ground with surprising efficiency, the way they rear up on their hind legs to see over obstacles, the way they test the wind with their incredibly sensitive noses. I know bears the way you know something after 16 years of professional, repeated engagement with it. The knowledge is in my body as much as my brain. It's become automatic, reflex. When I see a bear, or see what might be a bear, the identification happens the way breathing happens, without deliberate effort. The animal under that tree was not a bear. I cataloged this fact from 40 yards away, before I had approached, before I had any sensory information except what my eyes were giving me. My eyes said, wrong, Wrong in ways I couldn't immediately articulate but couldn't deny. The wrongness was physical, visceral. The kind of wrongness that your body registers before your conscious mind catches up. Not the wrongness of an animal that's injured or sick and therefore behaving abnormally. The wrongness of an animal that is behaving exactly as it should behave and is simply not the animal that should be in this location, making these shapes against this forest floor. The limbs were wrong first. The proportions of limb to body were off in ways that were hard to quantify without a reference point. A bear cub's limbs are stubby relative to its body, designed for climbing, for powerful digging, for the kind of locomotion that works across uneven terrain, at low speeds with significant torque. These limbs were longer, not grotesquely long, not alien long in a way that would have triggered immediate alarm, but longer than they should have been, with a reach to them, a ranginess that spoke of a different kind of locomotion entirely, a creature that moved differently, that covered ground differently, that was built for a different relationship with the vertical axis than any four-legged animal I had professional experience with. Even in the supine position, even motionless in sleep, or whatever state this was, the joints seemed oriented differently, angled differently, like they had been built on a skeletal structure that prioritized something other than what bear skeletal structure prioritizes. The coloring was the second thing, not the gray-black of a black bear cub, not the brown-black of a cinnamon-phase black bear, not the graduated brown of a grizzly, which was outside the normal range for this region anyway, but not outside my reference. This was a dark rust brown with a gray undercoat, visible where the light caught the fur at certain angles. A banded coloring in the individual hairs, darker at the root, transitioning through a middle-toned phase, darkening again at the tip, the layering creating a coat that appeared to shift color slightly depending on the angle of observation, lighter or darker as the light struck it from different directions. That kind of banded fur pattern has a specific function. It's found in certain canines, in certain wild cats, in animals whose natural environment requires adaptive camouflage in mixed light and shadow conditions. It is not a pattern I had ever seen in bear fur. Not in any bear, not in any photograph of any bear in any wildlife reference I had ever consulted. The head sat at an angle that was wrong for a bear. Not the angle of sleep or injury or exhaustion. Wrong in a structural sense. As if the neck muscles that held the skull were distributed differently, supported the weight differently, were arranged on a skeletal architecture that had been built with different design priorities than a bear's neck. The skull itself, from 40 yards through binoculars, was shaped in a way that took me a full, slow minute to parse. The cranial vault was too high. Bears have a relatively flat profile when viewed from the side, the skull dropping from the forehead to the snout in a specific arc that I could have drawn from memory. This skull rose above the eyeline before dropping, suggesting a cranial capacity that was proportionally larger than a bear's. A forehead, something like an actual forehead, the kind of feature that your brain associates with intelligence because it's associated with intelligence in the one species you know best. The kind of feature that says more is happening inside this skull than is happening inside the skulls of the animals I know. I have spent years trying to put this observation into language that doesn't sound like exaggeration. Every description sounds like embellishment. Every detail, when I say it plainly, sounds like the kind of detail you add after the fact to make a story more dramatic. But the forehead was there, visible through binoculars from 40 yards. A domed expansion of the cranial vault above the brow line, suggesting a brain that needed space. That was larger, proportionally, than the biology of this animal's apparent size should have produced. That was doing something with that space. The ears were the last thing I cataloged, and they were the detail that most clearly said, not known. Not a known animal, not a known category. They sat high on the skull, higher than bear ears, higher than wolf ears, in a position that oriented them more directly forward than either of those species normally manages. The shape was what stopped me, not the rounded, wide-set ears of a bear, not the erect, triangular ears of a canine. Something between those shapes, but not a simple average between them. Something that had its own logic, a slight forward cup that oriented the auditory opening in a specific direction with the deliberateness of design rather than accident of anatomy. The kind of ear structure you see in animals that have evolved to take in directional auditory information with significant precision. That hunt or communicate at ranges where the ability to aim hearing like a tool matters more than the ability to hear broadly. I stood at 40 yards and I looked at all of this, and I understood very clearly that I was looking at something I had no framework for. Not an unknown animal in the sense of an animal I hadn't personally encountered before. An unknown animal in the categorical sense. Something that shouldn't exist in the forest I was walking, because it didn't fit in any of the boxes that my 16 years of professional experience had built and filled and refined. the boxes that define the wildlife of the Pacific Northwest forests. The boxes that I depended on to tell me what was safe and what was dangerous and what required my attention and what could be noted and moved past. This animal didn't go in any of those boxes. It was doing something to my categorization system that the categorization system had no protocol for. It was simply registering as unknown, not anything I had reference for in the Pacific Northwest. I stood about 30 yards away from it and watched it without moving. Not approaching, not threatening, just watching. The breathing was deep and slow and regular, in and out with a rhythm that spoke of sleep or exhaustion or both. There was no mother anywhere that I could see or hear. No other animals nearby. No sounds except the wind in the canopy above and the small movements of the forest that were always there underneath the quiet. Just the cub and me and the 100 yards of space around us that was empty of anything else. I've been around bears in the field my whole career. 16 years of working in wilderness areas and managed forests and wild spaces where bears operate as apex predators, and you have to respect them because they have no reason to respect you. I've seen cubs, I've tracked mothers and backed away. I've encountered defensive females, and I've learned the exact speed at which you need to move to not trigger a charge versus the speed at which you need to move to escape if the charge comes anyway. There's a protocol for this kind of thing. You don't approach a cub, never. The mother is nearby and hiding, observing, and if you approach her offspring, you have made a declaration of threat that she will respond to with the full force of her body and her maternal rage. You document the location quietly. You back away slowly. You call the Forest Service. You assume the mother is waiting and watching just beyond the edge of your vision. That's the correct response. That's the response that keeps you alive. But something about this wasn't reading as a bear scenario. It wasn't the teeth. It wasn't the ears. It wasn't even the size or the proportions. It was something underneath all of that. A sense that this wasn't a situation that followed the rules of bear behavior that I had internalized over 16 years. I pulled out my binoculars and looked more carefully at the head. The ears were definitely wrong. They sat higher on the skull and had a different taper than bear ears. They looked almost mammalian but not quite, not in the way that bears or wolves or any canine are mammalian. The snout was too narrow, too pointed, tapering to something that looked almost elegant if you could separate it from the fact that it was attached to a wild animal lying injured in the forest. The visible teeth from the slightly open mouth where the animal was breathing were not canine, not ursine, not anything I could categorize quickly. They were long, they were curved. They were the kind of teeth you'd see in fossil displays when they were teaching you about animals that went extinct millions of years ago. Ancient animals, pre-modern animals, animals that shouldn't exist in the modern world. I called my supervisor, Jack. I used the radio, kept my voice steady, told him I'd found something that needed documentation before I moved on from the site. He told me to photograph it and move on to the next boundary marker. That was his answer. That was his protocol. I took 6 shots on my digital camera, making sure the angles were clear, making sure the identifying features were visible. I marked the GPS coordinates to the nearest meter. That part was procedure. That part was what I was trained to do. That part was the responsible thing. What I did next was not responsible. What I did next was the thing that changed the trajectory of my life, and I didn't know it yet. I approached the cub. The smell hit me about 10 feet away. It stopped me for a second. It wasn't the musk of a wild animal, not in the way that bears have a specific musky territorial scent, or the way that predators have a smell that your body recognizes as predatory even if your conscious mind is trying to deny it. This was something else entirely, organic but not fresh. It was like old hide that had been rained on repeatedly and dried in the sun multiple times, developing that particular smell that old leather gets when it's been exposed to weather for years. It was like a leather jacket that had been buried in dirt for a season and then dug up. There was something underneath that smell, something like spoiled copper, the metallic tang of old blood mixed into fur. The kind of smell you get when an animal has been injured for long enough that the wound has started to break down at a cellular level. I have no better description than that. The smell was complex and strange, and it communicated something about this animal that wasn't in the visual information. The smell said, "This creature is wounded. This creature has been hurt. This creature is carrying something inside it that shouldn't be there. This creature needs intervention, or it dies." The cub's eyes opened when I was about 6 feet away. Deep brown, almost black in the shadowed area under the fallen tree, they tracked me with a focus that was immediate and complete. Not predator eyes, not the kind that size you up and calculate how fast they can move. These were aware in a different way, conscious, tracking. The pupils were vertical, narrow. A vertical pupil in something this large shouldn't be anatomically possible. Cats have vertical pupils. Some reptiles have vertical pupils. Bears don't. Wolves don't. No canine has vertical pupils. Yet there it was, tracking my movement from left to right, from right to left, responding to the position of my body in space. The breathing shifted immediately. It went from deep and slow to faster, more shallow. The animal was awake now, definitely awake. I could see the ribcage moving more quickly, more visibly. There was a wound on the left flank, a gash about 6 inches long, running from what looked like just below, where the shoulder should be down, toward the rear leg. The fur around the wound was matted with dried blood that had turned brown and stiff. I could see what looked like claw marks underneath the main gash. Deep marks. Vicious marks. The kind of marks that are made by something with significant force behind it, something large, something that knew exactly how to use claws to maximize damage. Something had done this to the cub, something larger. Something predatory or territorial or protective of something that the cub had threatened. I didn't know which, but I knew the wound was serious and it was infected, or starting to get infected, and the cub's chance of surviving a night alone in the forest with a wound like that was extremely low. I made a sound then, not words, not a threat vocalization, just a low, soft sound meant to indicate peaceful intent. The kind of sound you make when you're approaching an injured animal and you don't want to startle it into panic. The cub's breathing slowed slightly. The vertical pupils continued to track me, and I understood in that moment that this animal was capable of understanding social communication. It understood that I was trying to convey peace, and it understood that I was also a potential threat, but it couldn't move fast enough to flee. It was trapped by its own injury and its own weakness, and it had made the choice to remain still and observe rather than panic. I made a decision that I've regretted and not regretted in equal measure for 2 decades. I knelt down and opened my water bottle and poured some into my hand. The cub's head lifted slightly, the nose twitched. It had caught the scent of the water, or maybe the scent of me. I set my hand down in the dirt, maybe 2 feet from its face, and waited. It took the water. The tongue came out, gray-pink, and lapped at my palm. It drank for about 15 seconds, then pulled back and laid its head down again. The flank was rising and falling harder now. It was exhausted. It was injured. It needed care that I couldn't give it here in the field, 35 miles from the nearest town. The temperature that night was going to drop to the low 40s. The forecast was rain moving in. The cub wasn't going to make it through the night alone. I made the decision that no field worker should ever make. I picked it up. It was light, lighter than I expected. I'd say 20 pounds, maybe 25. The ribs were visible under the skin. It was hungry. It was hurt. It was probably 4 or 5 months old, still dependent, still in that window where mother care was life or death. When I lifted it, it didn't struggle. It made a sound, low and quiet, something between a whimper and a vocalization I'd never heard before, almost like a child making a closed-mouth groan. That was the first time I thought, genuinely thought, I need to understand what this is. I hiked back to my truck and took about 40 minutes of walking, moving carefully through terrain, trying not to jostle the cub, trying to keep the weight distributed across my arms and chest in a way that wouldn't cause it additional pain. The cub stayed motionless the entire time. I wasn't even sure if it was conscious or just in a state of shock or shutdown that comes when an animal is injured and exhausted and has given up resistance. Its weight was distributed across my arms and chest, and its head moved occasionally, turning to look at my face, trying to see me, trying to understand what was happening. Not curious in the way that an animal is curious about something new. Not searching in the way that an injured animal searches for the familiar, just aware, present, conscious, able to track and observe even in a state of suffering. At the truck, a 1998 Chevy Silverado with a full cab and bench seats, I laid the cub carefully in the back where I had set up a cot for long shifts in the field, a cooler for drinking water and lunch, and an emergency kit with first aid supplies and tools and everything you might need if you broke down miles from civilization. The temperature was dropping fast. The sun was getting low on the horizon, and the kind of cold that comes with October evening was setting in. I had a thick wool blanket in the truck cab, the kind you use for emergency situations. I wrapped the cub gently, carefully, avoiding the wound on its flank, being very deliberate about not causing additional pain or trauma. The cub didn't resist. It didn't fight the blanket or try to escape or do any of the things an injured wild animal should do when a human is handling it. It seemed to understand that this was help, that this was something different from threat, that my touch was not something to fear. I drove to town that evening. The town was about 35 miles from the forest, a small place with the kind of services you get in a rural area. A gas station, a grocery store, a hardware store, a few restaurants, and a motel. The motel was the kind that doesn't ask a lot of questions about the people who check in or what they're bringing with them. I paid cash for 2 nights. I carried the cub, wrapped in the blanket, through the back entrance. Nobody saw, nobody commented. The room cost $48 a night. I remember the specific amount, because I paid cash and I had exactly $96 in my wallet, which was the cost of 2 nights and nothing else. And I didn't have another plan that didn't involve significant explanation to people I didn't want to explain things to. The decision to help the animal was not a planned decision. It was the kind of decision that happens before you finish thinking about it. By the time I was processing the fact that I'd made it, I was already in it, already carrying something I didn't know how to categorize toward a truck I wasn't sure would be clean enough after this. Already committed to something I couldn't undo without simply abandoning the animal in a parking lot, which I wasn't willing to do. The room had 2 beds, a television mounted high on the wall, a bathroom with a shower that I wouldn't use until the second evening, a small desk against one wall, a chair. The carpet was dark and the lighting was dim, and it smelled of cleaning products and the specific dead air of a room that hadn't been occupied in several days. I laid the cub on the floor near the heating unit because I knew I'd need to keep the temperatures consistent, and I wanted the heat source close. I put the blanket down first, folded to create a layered pad, and laid the animal on it with the same care I'd use carrying it out of the forest. Slow movements, nothing sharp, nothing that would register as threat. The cub didn't move when I set it down, but its eyes opened again and tracked me as I moved through the room, the vertical pupils adjusting to the shift in light with a speed and precision that was, once again, categorically wrong for any bear or canine I had experience with. The first thing I examined properly was the wound, 6 inches from the edge of the shoulder down toward the rear hip, running front to back in a direction that told me the source of the wound had been positioned in front of the cub when the strike was made. Not a wound from flight, not the kind of laceration you receive when you're running and something catches you from behind. The angle said, facing. The cub had been facing something when this happened, had been meeting something or moving towards something. And that something had struck from a downward angle, from above, scoring across the upper body, missing the spine by a margin that was uncomfortable to look at. A near miss. The kind of near miss that happens when something is trying to kill something else and doesn't quite land the killing blow. Whatever had done this to the cub, it had been larger. It had been above. It had known exactly where to aim. I cleaned the wound over the course of an hour, working carefully, taking my time, making sure I wasn't causing additional pain or distress beyond what was necessary. The cub made a single sound during the cleaning process, when I reached the deepest part of the gash where the tissue was most traumatized. Not a cry, not a sharp pain vocalization. Just a deep exhale with a sound underneath it that communicated something about the pain without making it dramatic. An acknowledgement, an expression of tolerance. I've cleaned injuries in the field on people who couldn't manage that level of patience with the process, who couldn't stay still, who vocalized freely and moved away from the source of discomfort with every instinct they had. This animal stayed still, made that one sound, and then was quiet, watching me work, its breathing deepening as the wound was cleaned and treated and dressed, as if the cleaning itself were a form of relief that outweighed the discomfort. The first night, I slept in 2-hour intervals, waking to check on the cub, to verify the wound dressing, to make sure the animal was breathing normally and not showing signs of infection or fever, developing in ways that would require decisions I didn't want to make. The cub slept deeply in these intervals, the kind of sleep that comes from exhaustion and trauma and the body's need to shut everything down and focus all available resources on repair. But when I woke, it woke, not with alarm, not with the startled defensive response of a wild animal woken suddenly by human movement. With the slow, deliberate opening of eyes that had already been tracking me on some level below waking consciousness. As if its awareness was keyed to mine, as if it was monitoring my state of rest and wakefulness the way that a very young human infant monitors its caretaker, with the whole body, with some instinctual channel that bypassed the need for visual or auditory information, and was simply aware of the presence or absence of safety in the room. Around 2:30 in the morning of the second night, I was awake and watching the cub breathe, and I began to talk. Not loudly, not even at normal conversation volume. Just a quiet murmur, the kind of voice you use when you're alone, and thinking out loud is more comfortable than silence. I talked about the forest, about the work I'd been doing that season, about the specific stand of old-growth ponderosa I'd been assessing that week, trees that had been growing on that slope for 300 years, that had survived fires and drought, and a century of human incursion into the region that would outlast me and probably outlast the management systems that were currently protecting them. I talked about what it was like to walk through a forest in October, when the light had that particular quality. I talked about nothing important. I just talked. Because the silence of a motel room with an injured animal in it at 2:30 in the morning is the kind of silence that needs to be filled with something gentle. The cub's head lifted from the blanket about 5 minutes into this, not alertly, not defensively. Slowly, with the deliberate movement of an animal that is not alarmed but is paying attention. It oriented its ears toward the sound of my voice, and it listened. And I understood in that moment something that I've spent 2 decades trying to articulate properly. The animal was interested in the sound of my voice as something meaningful, not as a threat sound or a food signal or a territorial marker, as communication. As information that might contain content beyond the basic predator or prey signal that most animals decode from human sound. It was listening the way that something listens when it's trying to extract meaning from a signal, when the words matter independently of the tone, when the pattern of the language itself is something it is trying to parse. I talked to the cub for most of that night. I'm not going to pretend that wasn't unusual behavior. There was no one there to see it, no audience, no one to evaluate what I was doing or why. Just me and an injured animal in a motel room at 2 in the morning, and something in the quality of the interaction that made conversation feel not just appropriate but necessary. Like an exchange between 2 creatures who had established a basic understanding of each other's intentions and were now exploring, carefully, what else might be possible. On the morning of the 3rd day, the cub ate. Raw ground beef from a container I'd gotten from a diner down the road. I had tried different things the previous 2 days. Chicken, fish from a can, which smelled wrong the moment I opened it, and the cub's nose had registered an opinion about immediately and completely. A wrinkle of the muzzle that communicated something between distaste and mild offense. The ground beef was different. The cub smelled it from across the room, lifted its head fully, tracked the container as I carried it across the space. I set it on the floor, 2 feet from where the cub was resting, and waited. It got to its feet. That was the first time I understood the full architecture of what I was dealing with. Standing, the cub's proportions became clearer, more legible than they had been in the supine position. The hind legs were longer than I'd registered. Not grotesquely long, but long in a way that the body's center of gravity sat higher than a bear's, or any canine's would sit. More upright. The front limbs were shorter, relative to the hind limbs, in a ratio that was different from anything in the known mammalian framework I had been trained in. And the hands, and it was becoming harder not to use that word, showed me something I hadn't registered in the motel darkness of the first 2 nights. When the cub reached toward the container of food, the digits moved individually, 4 digits and a 5th that was shorter, offset, that performed a partial opposition to the others. Not human proportion, not primate proportion, but the functional anatomy of grasping, of deliberate manipulation, of a creature that handled things with intention and some degree of precision. The eating was deliberate. Not the ravenous scarfing of a starving animal, consuming whatever its body was demanding. The cub ate with an organization that suggested awareness of satiation, awareness of its own body's needs distinct from what hunger demanded. The difference between eating because your body requires fuel and eating compulsively because the food is present. It ate roughly 1/3 of the container and stopped, settled back, looked at me with those vertical pupils in the morning light coming through the curtains. And I had the very specific, very uncomfortable, very undeniable sense that it was waiting to see what I did next, that the interaction was not over, that there was something more that was expected of this transaction, that we were not yet done with each other. I needed to think about what the next step was. I couldn't keep it in a motel room indefinitely. I couldn't take it to a vet because the moment I did, the questions would start. What is it? Where did it come from? Who does it belong to? Who is responsible for it? What species is it? What do you want to do with it? Have you contacted the Forest Service? Have you contacted Fish and Wildlife? I had no answers to any of those questions. I had a photograph of coordinates. I had a GPS point. I had my own experience and my own observations. But I had nothing that would explain what I was holding to anyone who looked at the cub and tried to categorize it into a known animal category. I had a decision to make about what was right, what was kind, what gave the cub the best chance at survival. On the 3rd day, the cub was noticeably stronger, visibly stronger. It ate raw meat. It ate a significant amount of raw meat, taking it from my hand, chewing it, processing it, getting nutrients from it. It moved around more confidently. The limp was still there, but lighter, reduced. The cub was healing faster than should be possible. That was interesting. That resilience, that speed of recovery. That suggested that whatever this animal was, it had healing capabilities that exceeded normal mammalian recovery rates. I decided that I would take it back to the forest. I would return it to the location where I found it. Maybe the mother was still searching the area. Maybe there were others nearby who were looking for the cub. The cub had been away from its family for at least 3 days, possibly 4. Wild animals have survival instincts that run deeper than anything a human can provide in a motel room. A motel room is not a forest. A human caretaker is not a mother, or a pack, or whatever family structure these animals maintain. I drove back to the site early that 3rd morning. The drive was quiet. My thoughts were quiet. The cub slept in the back, wrapped in blankets. I brought the cub and a week's worth of supplies, food, water. A weatherproof plastic bin with the top weighted down but not sealed, so that something could get in to retrieve supplies if needed, but the rain couldn't saturate everything. I hiked to the exact location and set the cub down carefully in the clearing where I'd found it. The ponderosa was still there, the massive fallen tree that had been partially sheltering the cub. The hollow where it had been lying was still visible. I left the supplies nearby, inside the plastic bin, in a location that the cub could find if it stayed in the area. Something could get in. The cub could get to it if needed. The cub looked up at me as I stepped back, creating distance between myself and the animal. That awareness in the eyes again, that consciousness, that understanding. No panic, no confusion, no distress call or cry for help. Just acceptance, just an awareness that something was happening and that the animal understood it and had chosen to accept it. I turned and hiked out without looking back. I drove back through the town without stopping, past the motel where we'd spent 3 days. I watched the building pass in the rearview mirror, and I thought about the specific quality of those 3 days. How they had been, in the surface sense, among the most ordinary days of my working life. I had woken up. I had fed an animal. I had treated a wound. I had sat in a motel room and talked to something that couldn't answer me in language. And in the deeper sense, they had been the most extraordinary days I had ever had. The most alive days. The days in which the world had been most fully and visibly real to me. Not the world of timber management contracts and GPS coordinates and Forest Service protocols. The world underneath that one. The world that was always there, always operating, always full of things that didn't fit the maps humans had drawn of it. I've tried to understand why the choice to pick up the cub felt so completely automatic, why it didn't feel like a choice at all in the moment of making it. The professional protocol was clear: document, withdraw, call the Forest Service, let the system handle it. I knew the protocol. I had followed it dozens of times for exactly the situations the protocol was designed to cover. This wasn't one of those situations. This was something that the protocol had no language for. And when the protocol runs out of language, you're left with whatever is underneath the protocol. The instinct, the value, the thing you actually are when no system is giving you instructions. What I actually am, it turns out, is someone who picks up injured things and tries to keep them alive. I've wondered since then whether the cub knew that before I did, whether it was the cub's awareness of that fact, communicated through those tracking eyes in the early morning forest light, that made the choice feel automatic, whether something was read in me, identified, flagged, whether the choice I thought I was making freely had already been made by something else, on my behalf, before I even got close enough to see the wound properly. I can't answer that. I don't know how to test it. But I know that standing in that clearing with the cub, looking up at me from the fallen tree, I didn't feel like a person in the process of making a decision. I felt like a person who had already made one, who just needed to catch up to what his body was already doing. The forest was quiet when I hiked out. October, quiet. The specific silence of a forest where the birds have mostly gone, and the insects are gone, and the only sounds are wind in the canopy, and the occasional crack of a dead branch settling, and the distant sound of water in a drainage somewhere to the northwest. My footsteps in the pine duff, my own breathing, and the full weight of what I'd just set in motion settling into me with every step away from the clearing. I didn't cry. I want to be clear about that, because I think there's an expectation that a moment like this would produce tears, would produce some kind of emotional release proportional to what had just happened. I've cried in the forest before. Anyone who has worked in wild places long enough and is honest about it will tell you this. The forest produces grief sometimes, the specific grief of beauty and impermanence and the awareness of how much exists that you'll never fully know. I didn't cry leaving that clearing. I walked out steady and clear-eyed, and with a feeling in my chest that I didn't have a name for then, and still don't have a fully adequate name for now. Something between grief and gratitude and the particular solemnity of having done something that mattered. That was real. That changed the structure of things in ways you couldn't quantify, but couldn't deny. When I got back to my truck, I sat in the cab for 20 minutes before starting the engine. I sat in the cab, and I looked at the forest through the windshield, and I tried to understand what I was feeling and what the next steps were, and what kind of person I was now, compared to the person who had parked this truck and hiked in with a clipboard and GPS coordinates and the full expectation of a routine afternoon of boundary work. I didn't find adequate answers to any of that. I started the engine and drove. I filed the report with my supervisor that evening, documented the cub, noted the possible injury, noted the animal's behavior and unusual characteristics. I submitted the photographs. The company's standard procedure was to escalate anything anomalous to the Forest Service. That happened. I got a call from a ranger the following week asking about the coordinates and the animal's description. I told him everything I could remember: the teeth, the ears, the eyes, the injury. His response was notable for what it didn't include. He didn't say, "That's a black bear cub, someone must have been feeding it," or "That's likely a coyote with mange," or any of the conventional wildlife explanations. He said, "We'll check the coordinates," and he hung up. I never heard from him or the Forest Service again about that incident. I went back to work. The season ended. The following spring, I returned to the old coordinates. The cub supplies were gone. The bin had been moved, torn open, the contents scattered, empty. The bin itself had claw marks, deep gouges in the plastic larger than any bear paw print I'd ever seen. I stood there for maybe 10 minutes, looking at that torn plastic and thinking about the next piece of the story. And the piece I'm going to tell you now is the part that changes everything.
Quick thing before we move on, I have this book coming out. It's called the Dogman Codex. It's a compilation of all my research and findings. Been working on it for a long time. So if you want to check that out, links down below. Now let's get you back to the video.
2 weeks after I found the torn supplies, I was working alone on a different part of the forest. Not hiking, working, thinning trees, marking lines. The afternoon had gone quiet in that specific way that happens when nothing in the forest is moving. No birds, no insects, no rustle. Dead quiet. And I felt watched. Not a general sense of being in the wilderness, where obviously there's wildlife around. That specific sensation of being visible to something that can see you. I looked up from my work and saw something move at the edge of the clear cut about 60 yards away. A shape. Large, upright. The shape of something tall and broad-shouldered, and definitely not human-shaped enough to be human, but humanoid enough in the way it carried its weight that it stopped my brain for a second. Then it moved behind a thick stand of second-growth fur and was gone. I radioed my supervisor, told him I'd seen what I thought might be a mountain lion. The response was routine. Get to your truck, end the workday, don't work alone. I did that. I packed my gear and drove out. And I didn't go back to that site for the rest of the season. But here's what happened next. And this is where the story shifts from something I saw into something that saw me. Over the course of that spring and summer following the release, I started finding things, objects, small things left in specific places. On the windshield of my truck when I'd parked it in the forest to do work. Clean, dry placement, even though the truck had been exposed to weather and rain. On my porch at home, hundreds of miles away from the forest, in a residential neighborhood where no wild animal should be able to move without being seen. Once in the bed of my truck under a tarp, placed deliberately, hidden but findable. Objects, small things mostly. A bone, not freshly killed bone with blood still on it. A clean bone, probably from a deer, probably from an animal that had been dead for a while, carefully selected and left. A segment of spine, vertebrae linked together, the kind of anatomical structure that would require knowledge of anatomy to extract cleanly. A cluster of feathers, black and gray, tied together in a bundle with what looked like plant fiber, twisted together, intentionally bundled. The precision of it suggested hands, intelligent hands, hands that could tie a knot. And then, one evening in early August, objects appeared on my kitchen table inside my house. My house. My locked house. I came home from work and there were objects on my kitchen table. The doors were locked. The windows were locked. The house was secure the way you secure a house. But objects were on my kitchen table. A piece of smooth river stone and a piece of metal. The metal piece is the one I'll remember for the rest of my life. A small brass tag, the kind that dogs wear, old and corroded from decades of weather exposure. The metal was pitted and worn. It was covered with parallel gouges that looked intentional, cut marks. The kind of marks that are made with deliberate force and repeated action. 4 parallel lines, 6 parallel lines in another section, 7 parallel lines in yet another section. Different groupings, different patterns. It looked like a record. It looked like something that had been deliberately marked multiple times. On the reverse side was engraved a name and a date. The name was Sarah. The date was 1987. I sat at my kitchen table for a very long time, just looking at that tag, trying to understand, trying to process. Sarah, 1987. Who was Sarah? What happened in 1987? How did this tag end up on my kitchen table? And why the marks? Why the parallel gouges? Why was something deliberately scarring this metal object over and over? I kept the tag. I have it still. I've had it for nearly 20 years now. I've never understood why it was left for me. I've never understood what it means or where it came from. Not really. I've theorized, I've researched, I've tried to find a Sarah who went missing in 1987 in the Pacific Northwest, but I've never found a satisfactory answer. Sarah. 1987. And parallel gouges that look like they were made by claws, by something with significant bite force and intentional purpose, deliberately marking the surface repeatedly over years or decades or possibly longer. I put it on paracord, strong paracord, the kind of cord that you use for serious applications. I wore it under my shirt for years. I wore it against my chest. I wore it as a signal or a promise or an acknowledgement that I was marked and that I understood what the marking meant. I still have it. I don't wear it anymore. The object stopped appearing after about 6 months of the pattern starting. The watching feeling stopped. The presence that I had felt, the sensation of being observed by something intelligent and patient and purposeful, that presence gradually faded. Life returned to normal, the kind of normal that you can have after something has fundamentally broken your reference frame about what's possible and what isn't possible in the world. I finished the contract with the forestry company. The season ended. I moved on to different work, different regions, different projects. For years after that, the forest became just the forest again, a place of work, a place of normal wildlife and normal dangers. No watched feeling, no objects appearing, just the normal business of living and working in wild places. But there was always something sitting underneath, a feeling that something in that place knew my face, remembered me, understood on some level that I had held one of theirs when they were vulnerable, and that had been noted. In 2008, I was teaching a wilderness safety class for a community college, a basic outdoor skills class. Small group, about 12 people, mostly people who wanted to understand how to move safely through wild areas. We were on a day hike in the Wallowa Mountains, not far from where the original incident had happened. Not deliberately. I hadn't planned the route with that in mind. It was just a convenient location for the coursework, good terrain for teaching trail navigation and bear awareness, good elevation change to demonstrate how to move efficiently over distance, close enough to a trailhead that we could do a complete loop in a single day. Afternoon light, the kind of light that comes in autumn when the sun is lower and everything gets that golden quality. Cool temperature, the kind of chill that's invigorating rather than uncomfortable. Around 4 o'clock in the afternoon, we came to a ridge with a view out over a valley below. It was the kind of view that makes people stop and just look for a minute. Mountain terrain rolling away to the horizon. Open ridges. I set the group down for a short break. 5 minutes to catch breath and drink water. I wanted one, nothing fancy, standard stuff. I was sitting maybe 20 feet from the main group, taking notes on the trail conditions, when I heard something from the other side of the ridge. Movement, heavy movement, something substantial moving through the underbrush. Not the quick, panicked movement of a small animal, not the crashing, fast movement of something running or fleeing, walking, deliberate, the kind of movement that comes from something large and confident and moving with purpose towards something. The group heard it too. Of course they did. The conversation died immediately. The chatter and the relaxed voices all stopped at exactly the same moment. A woman sitting on a rock near the edge of the group asked if it was a bear. I said we should stay calm, gather together, not make fast movements, move as a group, put the younger, stronger people on the outside, keep the children in the middle, textbook response, protocol response, the response that you give when you want people to follow procedures that have been established and proven to work. But I knew exactly what that sound was, the weight of it, the deliberateness of it, the way the vegetation was moving aside to accommodate something large and bipedal and powerful. The sound signature was completely different from anything that moves on 4 legs. It was the sound of something walking upright, something with significant mass distributed vertically. It crested the ridge about 40 yards from us, and for maybe 3 seconds, I saw an adult dogman in full daylight. I saw it completely. I saw it in afternoon light, in a space where there was no possibility of doubt, no way to convince myself I'd hallucinated or misinterpreted or been fooled by shadows and suggestion. I saw it, and it saw me. There was no ambiguity in that moment. There was recognition, there was acknowledgement. There was the understanding that passed between 2 creatures that had met before and had history with each other. It was 7 feet tall, possibly slightly more. The height was significant but not grotesque. It was the proportions that made the height feel impossible, the way that the weight was distributed, the way that the muscle was arranged on a frame that was built for bipedal efficiency. Dark gray-brown coat, thick and dense, with an undercoat that was visible where the light caught it at certain angles. The kind of coat that you get from animals that live in temperate forests, that are exposed to weather and seasons and temperature fluctuations. The build was lupine in its basic structure, but not fully lupine. The shoulders were broader than a wolf's would be. The posture was more upright. It stood on its hind legs with the kind of balance and stability that meant this was normal behavior, not some rare rear-up that a bear or an animal might do in a moment of surprise or threat. The front limbs hung at its sides, and the claws or fingers or whatever they were visible and long. Long enough to cause significant damage. Long enough to leave the gouges I had seen on the tag. The face was the thing that held all of my attention. Lupine in structure, but not entirely. The snout was long, tapered, pointed at the end, but not as extreme as a wolf's snout or a dog's snout would be. It was elegant in a way that nothing in the modern animal kingdom should be elegant. The eyes were forward-facing. Mammalian in construction, but intelligent in a way that I had no frame of reference for. Deep intelligence. Looking at me with the kind of recognition that should not exist in a wild animal. The kind of recognition that you see when one human being looks at another human being and remembers them. When they understand the history between you. When they understand that there is an agreement or an understanding or a debt between you. The head tilted slightly, just barely. A gesture that would have been almost imperceptible if I hadn't been watching so carefully. A gesture I recognized from 20 years before. From the cub's eyes looking up at me in that motel room in a town I don't want to name. From the vertical pupils tracking my face. From the awareness that lived behind those eyes. The same gesture, the same recognition. One of my students, a young man, probably in his late 20s or early 30s, sitting in the middle of the group, started to stand, started to move, started to reach for something, maybe his phone, maybe thinking he was about to be attacked, or that he needed to document what he was seeing, or that he needed to take some kind of action. The dogman's head moved just slightly, not a lot, not a dramatic reorientation, just an ear twitch and a subtle shift in body position that redirected its attention from me to the young man. But the message was absolutely clear. The message was, don't move, don't do that, sit down. Everyone stayed still after that. Nobody moved. The young man sat down very carefully without being told by me or by anyone else. He understood. What I saw in the 12 people around me in those 6 seconds is something I've thought about many times since. The range of responses was wide. One woman, the retired nurse I mentioned, had gone completely still in a way that wasn't fear stillness. It was recognition stillness. The kind of stillness that happens when you see something that answers a question you've been carrying, a question you might not have known you were carrying. She would tell me later, weeks after the class, that she had been dreaming about the forest differently since she was a child. That she had grown up in the Pacific Northwest and had always felt, in specific places, the specific sensation of being watched by something intelligent. That she had filed this away as childhood imagination, had carried it for 40 years as a pleasant memory rather than anything significant. And then she had stood on that ridge and seen something that made her understand all at once what the childhood feeling had been pointing at. I drove home from that class thinking about recognition, about the specific mechanism of it. The cub I had held in that motel room had been small, 20 pounds, light enough to carry with one arm once I had the carry position right. The fur had been the fine, soft texture of juvenile fur, not the dense adult coat. In every physically measurable characteristic, the cub and the adult were different organisms. Different scale, different proportion, different mass, different presence, different everything that you can put a number to. And yet, the recognition had been instantaneous, not effortful, not a moment of trying to match a present creature to a past memory, just recognition. The head tilting at the specific angle. That gesture. The same angle I remembered from the motel room, from the injured cub looking at my face in the dim light, trying to understand what was happening and who I was and whether I was safe. The same gesture, offered again, across 12 years, and the full transformation of the organism. The same angle that said, I know you, I remember, we have history. What that told me about the cognitive architecture of this species was more significant than anything I had observed the animal do in the physical realm. The capacity to maintain a detailed, specific memory of an individual human face and scent across more than a decade of physical development requires capacities that exceed what I had framework for in documented mammalian biology. Elephants remember, certain corvids remember. But the combination I was observing, the individual recognition, the intentional communication, the deliberate choice to appear in full afternoon light, and the management of that group through a combination of presence and precise behavioral signaling. That combination was asking me to revise my understanding of what intelligence means, what forms it takes when it doesn't take the human form. The dogman stood there for maybe 6 more seconds. 6 seconds doesn't sound very long when you talk about it, but 6 seconds of being looked at by something intelligent and powerful is a long time. 6 seconds of being observed and calculated and understood is an eternity. The animal was motionless, observing. Its nose was working, smelling the wind, processing the scent information that was coming from our direction. It could smell my fear. It could smell the fear of 11 other people who had just encountered something that shouldn't exist. And it was performing some kind of calculation based on that. Some kind of assessment, some kind of judgment. Then it turned and moved back the way it came, descending the ridge with the same deliberate pace it had used to climb it. In seconds, it was gone. The brush settled. The forest noise gradually returned. Birds making their late afternoon calls. Wind moving through the trees. The sound of people breathing. Of people trying to process what they had just experienced. I organized the group calmly. Said it had likely been a mountain lion. Said we should hike back to the trailhead. Said everyone did great and we'd meet back at the college parking lot. Said nothing else about what had happened or what anyone had seen. Most people had partially seen the dogman, but in that moment where something doesn't fit into the category of possible animals, people see what they expected to see. I let them keep that version of the story. But the young man who'd started to stand, he knew. He looked at me after the hike and he asked, "What was that?" And I said, "Mountain lion." And I meant it in the way that meant, "Don't ask again." He didn't. That encounter ended whatever pattern of contact had been established. The object stopped appearing. The presence that had seemed to track me in the forest eventually became background. The way that you live in a world and you stop noticing most of it. I moved through the years, I worked, I taught. I built a life that was normal in the way that lives are normal when you're the only person in the world who understands something specific about the world. But here's what I know now. The cub survived. The mother found it, or it found safety, or it healed. The adult I saw 20 years later was fully grown, fully healthy, fully integrated into whatever society or structure those animals have. It recognized me. It marked me. It let me know that it had marked me by appearing in broad daylight in front of witnesses, a thing that doesn't happen. An acknowledgement, the tag that was left for me. Sarah. 1987. I've thought about that for 20 years. I've never found out who Sarah was or what happened in 1987 or why her tag was in the possession of something that lived in the forest. But I think about it. Every time I see one of those tags, the kind you see on a dog, I think about Sarah. The scratch marks that have been documented across the Pacific Northwest. The ones that hunter guides report and then decline to talk about. The markings that appear on trees and rock faces in a pattern that seems too deliberate to be natural behavior. I think about those too. And I think about what an animal capable of empathy, capable of remembering an individual human across decades, capable of leaving intentional markers and objects and acknowledgments, is trying to communicate. I think about the fact that I took a living thing into a motel room when it was hurt. I gave it water and safety, and it was seen. It was remembered. I think about the fact that the adult version of that cub appeared to me with witnesses present, which means it wanted me to have credibility, to have corroboration, to have a story that wasn't just the story of one person alone in the forest. I still work with forests. Different regions now, different companies. But I notice everything. I notice when the forest goes quiet. I notice the small objects that appear. I notice the markings. And I understand that somewhere in the wilderness of the Pacific Northwest, something knows my face. Something intelligent and possibly grateful and definitely watchful. I don't know if that makes me safer or less safe. I don't know what the agreement is, but I keep the tag. I wear it sometimes. And I watch the edges of the forest. And every time I hear a story about someone seeing something in the woods, someone seeing a shape that doesn't fit, someone seeing something that made them question what should be possible, I wonder if they made the same choice I did, if they picked it up, if they gave it water, if they let it be seen. The dogman is real, I know that. Not in the way that skeptics want proof. Not in the way that requires a body or a video that can be analyzed. Real in the way that something is real when it changes how you understand the world. Real in the way that it's real when the animal looks at you and you understand on a cellular level that you have been recognized, that you have been noted, that whatever comes next is something you invited when you made the choice to be kind to something that was suffering. I'm still here. The dogman is still there. And 20 years later, it's still guarding. Part 2. The tag sits on my desk now in a small container, protected from the weather and the dust. Most days I don't look at it directly, but I think about it constantly. The weight of it, the history of it. Sarah, 1987. That's the name. That's the date. Both of them are engraved on the back with the kind of precision that suggests formal manufacture, the kind of precision that you get from a professional dog tag maker or a military identification system, not the kind of thing that happens by accident. The gouges were made by deliberate action. There's no doubt about this. They were deliberate, and they were repeated, and they were layered on top of each other. The grooves are too precise, too even, to be accidental damage from weather, or accident or random decay. Something or someone wanted that tag to be marked. Something or someone deliberately scratched it repeatedly over years or decades or possibly longer. The marks form a pattern that might mean something, or might just be record-keeping in a form that humans don't have the vocabulary to understand. The possibility exists that something wanted that name to be illegible, wanted to obscure the original identity of whoever Sarah was. The possibility also exists that something wanted the tag to be marked as claimed, wanted it to become more than a simple identification. The possibility exists that there's a system of marking at work here that I only barely understand and am only barely equipped to interpret. There's no way to know which possibility is correct, but I've spent 2 decades researching Sarah, 1987, trying to find any record of a person by that name who went missing or died in the Pacific Northwest in that year or around it. I've gone through archives, I've looked at missing persons databases, I've contacted local police departments and sheriff's offices, I've searched newspaper records from the period. I've conducted interviews with people who worked in forestry and wilderness management in the region during that era, and I've found dozens of Sarahs, dozens of women named Sarah who vanished or died or went missing in the Pacific Northwest region, but I've never found a Sarah whose disappearance or death or vanishing fits the pattern that the tag suggests. I've never found a Sarah whose story connects to the forest in the way that a marked tag suggests. Let me tell you specifically what that research looked like, because I want you to understand that this wasn't the casual Googling of an evening. This was years of sustained, methodical effort that used every tool I had available and that produced almost nothing. Almost. That word is doing significant work. I started in 2006, 2 years after the tag appeared on my kitchen table, when I first had enough distance from the shock of finding it to think clearly about what I might actually do. I started the way you start anything, with what you know. Name, date, possible region. I knew the tag was old. I knew the engravings were precise. I knew the name was a person's name and not a dog name in any era I could identify. I knew the date was 1987. I went to the Oregon State Library in Salem. During a week I had off between contracts, physical research, microfilm, the newspaper archives from Oregon and Washington from 1985 through 1990. I went through every issue, or as many issues as I could get through in a week of concentrated work, looking for any mention of a person named Sarah connected to any kind of disappearance or incident in a forested area. I went through the missing persons records from both state systems. I submitted records requests to county sheriff's offices in every county that abutted significant wilderness or national forest land in the 2-state region. I got back varying degrees of cooperation. Some counties were helpful, some sent me redacted documents, some sent me nothing at all. I found 12 women or girls named Sarah reported missing in Oregon and Washington during 1987. 12 open cases. I tracked down whatever information was publicly accessible on each one. 3 had been found, 2 alive and 1 deceased, within a year of the disappearance. 2 had cases formally closed as probable runaways. Adults making choices about their own lives, cases that the system had decided didn't warrant continued investigation. 1 was a 5-year-old girl who had gone missing from a campground on the Oregon coast and whose case was still open decades later and still visible in regional missing persons coverage when I was researching. Her name was Sarah, and the date was right, but the coastal campground setting had no geographic relationship to the deep forest territory I associated with the tag. The remaining 6 were adult women, disappeared 1987, still listed as open cases. I learned what I could from the public portions of their files and from newspaper coverage of the time. 1 had been a hiker reported missing by her hiking partner after they got separated in the Mount Rainier area. 1 had been a Forest Service seasonal worker who had not returned from a solo survey assignment in the Gifford Pinchot. That one stopped me for a while. A Forest Service worker, a solo assignment, a failure to return. I spent several weeks trying to find any additional information about this case and came up against a wall of unavailable records, some legitimately protected by privacy law and some that felt like something else. Like protection of a different kind. I never confirmed whether this Sarah had any connection to the tag, but I kept her file in my research notes with a specific marker I used for cases I couldn't eliminate. In 2009, I drove to Klamath County in southern Oregon because I'd found a death notice that listed among its survivors a daughter Sarah described as missing since 1987. The death notice was for a George Hales, age 71, died 1998. Survived by his wife Edna, his son Thomas, his daughter Sarah, missing since 1987. That one line, missing since 1987, not presumed deceased, not listed as having passed away. Missing since 1987, as if the family had held the door open for 11 years between the disappearance and the father's death, as if the absence had been carried as an open wound rather than a closed one. I went to Klamath County. I went to the courthouse. I went to the library and looked at the local newspaper from late 1987. I found a small item, 4 paragraphs in the local paper, about a woman named Sarah Christine Hales, age 24, who had been reported missing by her roommate in October 1987. The roommate had told police that Sarah had gone hiking the previous weekend and had not returned. Sarah had been in the habit of solo hiking in the area. The article listed the Klamath Marsh area as the last known general region of her activity. The investigation had found her vehicle at a trailhead. Nothing else? No body, no signs of violence at the vehicle, no witnesses. The trailhead was at the edge of a significant wilderness area. Beyond it was a lot of old-growth forest and not many people. The paper's follow-up, 2 weeks later, was 4 sentences. Still missing, family asking for information, contact information listed, search ongoing. And then nothing, no more coverage. The kind of nothing that happens when a case goes cold and the news cycle moves on and the missing person becomes a data point in a system rather than a story that anyone is still telling out loud. I sat with Sarah Christine Hales for a long time in the Klamath County Library. I sat with what I knew about her, which was almost nothing, and what I suspected, which was something I couldn't prove, and what I felt, which was something I'm still not fully able to name. A woman who went hiking alone in October 1987 and didn't come back. A trail leading into wilderness, a vehicle at a trailhead, and a brass tag, old enough to predate the disappearance, that had ended up in the possession of something in the forest that had held it and marked it and decided 20 years later to leave it for me. Was she marked? Had she made the same choice I made? What happens when a human is integrated into the system of marking and watching and reciprocity, and then something goes wrong? What is the relationship between being marked and being safe? I don't know. I've made peace largely with not knowing, but I keep her file. Sarah, 1987. That name is on the tag. Someone put it there. Something carried it through the decades. And I carry it now. I owe it to whoever she was to keep trying. In 2010, I took the tag to a wildlife biologist at Oregon State University. Said I found it on a property I was managing. He looked at the scratches and said, "This metal is old, 50s, maybe 60s. The scratches are made with something that has significant force, a powerful jaw or sharp claws. This has been deliberately marked, repeatedly." Could it be a wolf marking? I asked. Wolves don't mark things they kill. This was marked deliberately, which suggests intelligence and intent. I'd say it's more likely to be a primate, but there are no non-human primates in Oregon. You've either got a very old tag damaged by environmental process, or you've got something I can't classify. Not a pet, not random damage. Something with significant bite or claw force. Something intelligent. Something that had scratched the tag repeatedly with deliberate intent. In 2015, I was teaching a wilderness medicine class, and one of my students was a woman in her 50s named Margaret. She was a park ranger for a federal recreation area in Northern California. Had been working in that capacity for over 20 years, and had the kind of quiet confidence that comes from decades of moving through wild places and understanding wildlife and managing the interface between human recreation and animal habitat. Margaret deserves more space than I've given her before. She was the first person who gave me language for what I'd been experiencing. The first person who handed me a framework that fit the actual shape of my experience instead of requiring me to deform the experience to fit an existing framework. That's a specific kind of gift. The kind that you spend years being grateful for. She had been a ranger for 22 years when I met her in my wilderness medicine class. 22 years of working in the same federal recreation area, watching the same forest, building the kind of deep site-specific knowledge that only comes from sustained presence in a place. She knew the animals in her region as individuals, not metaphorically, literally. She could distinguish between individual black bears by their behavior patterns, their movement routes, their seasonal habits. She had given them informal names, not the way people name pets, but the way field researchers name study subjects, as an identification system that made her notes more useful than if she'd used numerical tags. She knew when specific animals had moved through her territory and when they hadn't. She knew when something in the behavioral pattern had changed. She noticed. She had noticed the Watchers 11 years before she met me, not as Dogman, not with that language. She had noticed an anomaly. A pattern of behavior that didn't fit the behavioral models she'd been trained on. Animals avoiding areas that had previously been active habitat. Trail cameras capturing something that her supervisor had told her was probably an artifact of image compression, and she had known, looking at the footage, was not an artifact of anything except a very large, very upright thing walking through the frame at 2 in the morning. Objects appearing in places where objects appearing was physically implausible. A feeling, consistent and specific, of being watched by something capable of sustained, intelligent attention. She had documented it carefully and without interpretation, building a private file that was 11 years deep by the time I met her. During a break in the class, during the kind of informal moment when people are stretching and getting coffee and taking a few minutes to decompress from the material, she asked me casually if I'd ever seen anything unusual in the forest. Not unusual like a rare animal or unusual wildlife behavior. Unusual in a different way. Wildlife behavior that didn't match the textbooks. A feeling that something was watching you in a way that a predator shouldn't be able to watch you. A presence that didn't follow the rules of animal behavior. I said carefully that I had heard stories. I said it in a way that conveyed that I had heard stories, but also that I didn't want to be overheard saying that. She seemed to understand exactly what I meant. She said, I ask because there's something in my region that a lot of us know about but don't talk about. Forest Service, rangers, park management, we all know. We've all had encounters, or we know people who have had encounters. It's intelligent. That's the first thing you have to understand. This isn't about an animal that's smart. This is about an animal that's intelligent. It walks on 2 legs. It's bigger than a black bear. It appears to watch specific people for years at a time. It leaves things, objects, small prey, marked things. Some of us call them watchers. Some of us call them the old ones. Some of us call them Dogman, but that's not accurate because Dogman suggests there's only 1 or 2 of them and suggests they're predatory in a simple way. But they're neither of those things. They're a population. They're complex. And they're trying to communicate. What are they? I asked. I don't know, she said. And I mean that sincerely. I don't know what biological category they fit into. I don't know if they're an isolated population of something that's supposed to be extinct. I don't know if they're a hybrid of something that exists and something that doesn't. I don't know what the DNA looks like or what their actual evolutionary history is. But I know they're not going to hurt you if you don't threaten them. I know they have a hierarchy and a structure. I know they remember people, individual people, by face, by scent, by some kind of identification system that I don't fully understand. I know they communicate through marking. I know that if you help one of them, you're marked by the others, recognized, watched over. It's not a bad thing. It's more like you're in a relationship with the forest itself, like you've been adopted into their system of reciprocity and debt and obligation. I felt something shift inside me when she said that. The weight of the tag around my neck, even though I had it tucked away and not visible. The sense that what I had been carrying for over a decade was being acknowledged by someone else who understood, someone else who had experienced the same thing. I showed her the tag. I told her where I got it, how I found it, when I found it, everything about it except the specific location coordinates and dates, which I'm still not ready to share completely. She examined it for a long time, turning it in her hands, looking at the scratches, running her fingers over the grooves, feeling the weight of the metal. Her expression didn't change as she examined it, but something in her posture shifted, a kind of recognition. This is a claim marker, she said. That's what we call them. The scratches, the pattern, the repeated markings. This is an animal saying, this one is watched. This one is protected. Or possibly this one is claimed. The original dog tag was probably worn by someone who had a similar experience to yours. Someone who helped one of them. Someone who showed kindness to something suffering and impossible. The scratches are newer markers on top of old markers. It's being passed along. Someone left it for you to know that you're part of a larger group. People who have been marked. People who are known. People who are being watched over by something that has decided you're worth protecting. I asked her if she was marked. She looked at me for a long moment, like she was deciding whether it was safe to show me. Then she nodded and pulled her sleeve up. There was a scar on her wrist, 4 parallel lines, clean. Deliberate, deeply healed. The kind of scar that you get from significant trauma that has long since recovered. But the 4 lines were too precise to be accidental. 4 lines in perfect parallel, even spacing, the kind of marking that takes intent. She ran her finger across the 4 lines with the casual familiarity of someone who had been doing this for years, touching something that had become part of the permanent record of her body. Then she told me what had happened, The encounter that had marked her happened in the 4th year of her observation period. She was on a late patrol, driving a fire road through a section of her territory that was remote enough that she rarely saw other vehicles after dark. She came around a bend in the road, and her headlights caught something in the ditch on the right side. She stopped, got out. It was a juvenile. She would estimate later, based on her knowledge of known juveniles of similar species, that it was roughly equivalent in developmental age to a 12 to 14-month-old bear cub, injured, conscious, aware of her with an immediacy and intensity that told her immediately this was not a standard wildlife roadside situation. The break in its right rear leg was compound, visible. She could see the bone, she could see the severity. She could also see that the animal was not responding to her presence with the defensive aggression that a severely injured wild animal in pain normally produces. It was looking at her, tracking her movement, and it was making a sound, not a distress call, not the high-pitched vocalization of a juvenile animal calling for its mother. A low, regular sound, patterned, that she told me she had spent years trying to understand and had come to believe was the juvenile equivalent of what she'd later learned to call a presentation call. A sound that meant, I am here, I am visible, I am not going to make this difficult. She made the same choice I made. She got it into her truck. She drove to the private location she had identified years earlier, a building on land owned by a family friend who asked no questions and provided space without explanation. She called in a favor with a retired veterinarian who had treated wildlife for 30 years, who had the equipment and the knowledge to set a compound fracture, and who, when he saw what he was looking at, said nothing for a long moment and then said, "This is the most interesting night of my professional life," and got to work. The bone was set. The wound was treated. The animal was given fluids and pain management and the specific kind of care that a compound fracture requires in the acute phase. 5 days. That's how long it took before the juvenile was mobile enough and stable enough to be relocated. 5 days in a building in a rural area under the care of a ranger and a retired veterinarian. 3 years later, Margaret was in her ranger station after hours, working late, the specific kind of late that happens when you're behind on paperwork and the alternative to staying is taking it home, and home needs to be separate from work in whatever way you can manage. She heard something outside. Not an unusual sound, not a dramatic sound, just movement, something in the direction of the tree line on the far side of the road. She went to the window. The adult was standing at the edge of the road, in the security light's reach, fully visible, fully upright. Looking at the window, looking at her. She told me that she recognized it in the same moment she registered it, before she had consciously processed the shape, or the size, or any of the identifying characteristics that might have told her what she was looking at. She recognized the eyes first, the specific quality of awareness in them, the same awareness she'd seen in the juvenile, looking up at her from the ditch on a fire road 3 years earlier. The awareness that communicated, immediately and without ambiguity, that there was someone home. That whatever she was looking at was a person in whatever sense mattered most. It stood there for maybe 30 seconds, long enough for her to be certain of what she was seeing, long enough for the certainty to become something that she knew she was going to carry for the rest of her life. Then it walked back to the tree line and was gone. She didn't move from the window for a very long time. She stood there in the ranger station with the security lights illuminating an empty road and the forest dark behind it, and she understood that she had been seen by something that had come specifically to let her know it had survived, that the juvenile she had helped was now an adult, that the choice she had made on that fire road 3 years earlier had been noted and remembered and reciprocated. The scar was on her wrist the following morning. "I have no memory of it happening," she told me. "I went to bed with a normal wrist and I woke up with this. No pain at any point. No sensation of the wound being made or healing, just the scar, as if it had always been there. I understand now what it means," she said. "It means I'm in the record, that somewhere in their system of knowing I exist as a person who can be trusted, who has been vouched for, who is watched over." She looked at me for a moment after she said that, looking to see how I was receiving it, whether I was the kind of person who could hold what she was telling me without needing to categorize it into something more comfortable. I held it, and she knew I was holding it, and that settled something between us that made the rest of the conversation possible. "How long have you known about the network?" I asked her. "The marked people, the community." 10 years, she said. "I found it the way you find most things like this, accidentally, following a thread in a forum that turned out to lead somewhere real. I was careful about it at first, testing, making sure what I was encountering was genuine rather than people performing an experience they wanted to have. But there are things you can only know from direct experience, and the people who had direct experience knew those things, And that's how I eventually let myself trust the network. What does the network think? I asked her. About what's happening, about where this is going. She thought about this, looking somewhere past me, past the classroom where we were standing, past the mountain terrain visible through the windows. The network thinks, she said finally, that we are at the beginning of something that has been building for a very long time. That the animals have been patient in a way that is very difficult for humans to understand, because humans don't have a natural reference for patience measured in generations. We think in years and decades. They think in something else, something longer. And the patience is ending, or the need for it is ending, and what comes next is something that none of us fully understands yet, but that all of us feel approaching, like pressure in the air before a storm, like the specific quality of silence before something happens. We sat with that for a while without talking. The weight of what she had told me, the corroboration, the fact that this wasn't something I was experiencing in isolation, that there was a network, that there was a pattern. Then I asked her how many people she knew who had been marked this way. In my region, at least 7 that I know about directly, she said. Probably more who won't talk about it, who are terrified of being labeled crazy, who are terrified of the attention that would come if they publicly stated that they had been marked by something that shouldn't exist. Across the Pacific Northwest, probably hundreds, maybe more. People who don't discuss it because it sounds impossible. And people who know it's real but don't want the attention or the trouble of trying to explain something that doesn't fit into the world most people live in. But they're out there, the marked people. And we know each other when we meet, even if we don't say anything out loud. We know, we recognize the pattern. After that conversation, I started paying attention differently. I started noticing other people who had the same look in their eyes when talking about the forest, the same careful way of not quite saying what they meant. There were marked people, people who had been seen and recorded and integrated into a system of knowledge that operated underneath the surface of normal wildlife management. There's a community, loose and informal but real, of people who have had encounters like mine. We communicate mostly by anonymous forums and encrypted emails and in-person conversations that never get documented. We share what we know. We share what we've seen. The consensus, insofar as there is one, is that the marking is protective, that people who have been seen and marked are less likely to suffer serious accidents in the wilderness, that the marking creates a kind of buffer between the marked person and the dangerous parts of the forest. An agreement without words. You showed us kindness, you will be protected. But there's also a feeling among marked people that we're being studied, that our lives are being observed by something intelligent that has decided we're worth watching. I started keeping a detailed journal of what I've observed since 2004, since the cub. Environmental observations, movements, objects left, sounds heard at specific times and locations, weather conditions, everything. I'm trying to build a data set that might explain the pattern. I'm trying to understand what's happening. In 2018, I was backpacking alone in the Cascades. 3-day trip, solo, which I don't usually do anymore because the attention I attract in the wilderness is something I've learned to manage carefully. But I needed to be alone. I needed to think. The second night, I was camped at a high lake, about 8,000 feet, cold already as the sun went down. I was sitting by my fire, drinking coffee, thinking about nothing in particular, and I heard the sound of something moving through the pine forest around my camp. Not a quick predator, not a foraging bear, something large and deliberate moving at walking pace, circling the camp perimeter. I could hear the weight of it through the ground, smell the musk on the wind. Different size circuits, which meant there were multiple animals. At least 2, possibly 3. I didn't move. I didn't look away from the fire. I just sat there, drinking coffee, and I waited. The circling continued for maybe 30 minutes. Then, without any change in the pattern that I could detect, the sound stopped. The animals had departed or had settled, or had somehow gone silent. I couldn't tell. I spent the night awake, listening to the forest. Nothing else happened. In the morning, the camp looked untouched. No prints in the dirt, no scat, no signs of animal presence. But I knew they had been there. I could smell their musk still lingering on the air. I could feel the weight of their observation. I packed up and hiked out that day instead of staying the planned 3rd night. And as I was leaving, I found something on the trail just ahead of my departure route. A bone, freshly killed deer leg, still warm, placed deliberately in the center of the trail where I would find it. An offering or a reminder that the forest was still watching me, that I was still marked, that the protection extended to me as long as I was in the territory. By 2020, I was convinced of the reality of the phenomenon, not convinced in the way that skeptics understand conviction. Convinced in the way that you're convinced when you've had repeated direct experience over 16 years. When the objects keep appearing, when the encounters keep happening. The objects were real, physical, made of matter. The encounters were real, not hallucinations or misidentifications or tricks of light. Something in the forest was aware of specific humans and was engaging in a form of relationship or communication with them. A two-way interaction, a system of exchange, something intelligent, something that understood the concept of debt and obligation. The pandemic changed things. Like it changed everything, it changed this too. In 2020 and 2021, millions of people simultaneously came to the forests. Tourists who had never been hiking before, unprepared hikers with no wilderness skills, entire families, groups of friends. The forest population exploded. Parking areas that normally had a dozen cars were full with 50. And with the crowding came a spike in sightings. Dogman sightings, Bigfoot sightings, unidentified animal sightings. The internet filled with reports, Reddit threads, TikTok videos, blurry videos taken on phones by people with no experience identifying wildlife. First-person testimonies from people who had encountered something in the forest that didn't match any animal they could name. Some of it was noise. Some of it was misidentification of known animals. Some of it was deliberate fabrication and hoaxing. But some of it was real. A significant amount of it was real, and the watchers responded. They changed their behavior. They shifted their patterns. They started appearing in places they hadn't appeared before, in places closer to civilization. They started being more visible, more willing to be documented, more willing to be filmed, more willing to interact with larger groups of humans, more willing to step into spaces where denial wasn't possible. It seemed like something had shifted at a fundamental level. Like the watchers had decided that hiding was no longer an option, that presence had to become undeniable, that the time for being a forest secret was ending, like they had made a strategic decision to force public acknowledgement. I received an email in February 2021 from someone I didn't know, a retired Forest Service worker from Washington State. He said he had read some of my anonymous forum posts about the marking phenomenon. He said he was marked. He said he had been watching the uptick in sightings with concern. He said he thought the watchers were trying to force acknowledgement. He said something was changing in the forest hierarchy. There's a split, he wrote. Some of them want contact. Some of them want to remain hidden. The ones who want contact are becoming more visible. The ones who want to remain hidden are becoming more aggressive. There's a tension that hasn't existed before. My theory is that the pandemic forced a decision point. Too many humans, too much disruption. The old boundaries are breaking down. You're marked, which means you might see this happen in real time. I wanted you to know that whatever you observe, you're not crazy. Something real is changing. I never got another email from him. He disappeared from the forums. I don't know if he stopped posting or if something happened to him. The possibility exists that it was a hoax, someone role-playing, writing fiction. But the possibility also exists that it was real, and that there was a communication network among marked people that I only had access to the edges of. By 2022, the reports had become impossible to ignore even for mainstream skeptics and wildlife agencies. There were too many sightings, too many videos, too many reports from credible witnesses, park rangers, Forest Service workers, people whose professional existence depended on understanding wildlife. The phenomenon had reached a critical mass where the old strategy of dismissal and silence was no longer tenable. The U.S. Forest Service commissioned a report, never published publicly, but I managed to access a summary through channels. The report was titled Non-Native Canine Species Activity in Pacific Northwest Forest Regions, 2015-2022. It outlined a correlation between increased human recreation, increased sightings of unidentified large canine animals, and specific patterns of behavior that didn't match known predator profiles. The report's conclusion was carefully worded, but essentially stated that there appeared to be an unidentified large canine species operating in the Pacific Northwest forest regions, that this species exhibited intelligence and social structure consistent with apex predators, that it was unlikely to pose a significant threat to human populations based on available data, and that further study was warranted. The report recommended establishment of study zones with limited human access, installation of trail cameras in strategic locations, and establishment of a database for sighting reports. None of these recommendations were implemented publicly, but I suspect they were implemented quietly. I suspect there's a network of government-owned trail cameras in the forest now, capturing data that the public will never see. I suspect there are study zones that are cordoned off with fences and signs that ostensibly are for environmental protection, but are actually for something else. I've started to notice the cameras. They are placed in locations that are too strategic to be random. They are newer technology than the Forest Service usually deploys. They are pointed at specific tree stands and clearings where I've seen marking activity or found objects. Someone is documenting. Someone is collecting data. Someone in government knows what these animals are and is trying to understand them. In 2023, I was teaching a class near Mount Jefferson in Oregon, a 3-day wilderness medicine course. The last day we were hiking an established trail, moving at a moderate pace. Nothing extreme. We came around a switchback, and there was a dogman standing directly on the trail ahead of us, not hidden, not attempting concealment. Standing fully in the open, maybe 200 yards away, in afternoon light, perfectly visible. The class stopped. People gasped. Someone reached for their phone, and the dogman made a sound, not a howl, not a growl. A vocalization that was almost like speech, a tonal shift that carried intent. And everyone froze, because they all understood the message at a level deeper than language. This is a warning. Stop moving, don't approach, but don't be afraid. We waited. The dogman stood there for maybe 30 seconds. It looked directly at me across the distance between us. I had the tag on under my shirt. I could feel it like a weight against my chest. And I understood in that moment what the tag was for. The marking wasn't just for protection, it was for identification. It was so that I would be recognized if something happened. It was so that if I encountered one of them, they would know that I had been seen before, that I was part of the network, that I was not a threat, that I was marked. The dogman looked at each member of my class for a moment, each person individually, a visual identification, a scanning. Then it turned and walked back the direction it came from, into the tree line. Gone, but not before everyone in that class had seen it. Not before it had established its presence as undeniable. Not before everyone had footage on their phones, because people take videos of everything now. The footage spread. Of course it did. It went to Reddit, it went to social media. It got shared in forums dedicated to cryptids and unexplained wildlife. And instead of the standard dismissal, something different happened. The responses were divided between those who recognized the footage as real and those who questioned its authenticity. But there was no unified skeptical explanation. There was no one saying, "This is obviously a man in a suit," or "This is definitely a bear." People who had seen dogmen in their own regions started corroborating. People who had found objects in their forests started posting about it. The network suddenly went visible. I contacted the ranger who had initially responded to my 2004 report. I still had his name in my notes from the official Forest Service report that I'd received and filed. He was retired now, living in Eugene, Oregon, a few hours away from the forest he'd spent decades managing. I drove to see him. The drive took me through country I knew, through familiar landscapes that had shaped my understanding of wilderness and wildlife, and the relationship between humans and wild places. His name was Robert. He was in his 70s, tall, weathered from decades in the forest. The kind of man who has spent so much time outside that his skin has absorbed the sun and the wind and the seasons into permanent creases and lines and the deep tan that comes from a lifetime of exposure. I told him I was the person who reported the cub in 2004. I told him I'd been trying to understand what happened in the years after, trying to understand what the report meant and what it implied, and what system of knowledge I had been incorporated into without my understanding or consent. He remembered immediately, not a vague recollection or a general sense of remembering, specific, clear. He remembered the report. He remembered the description. He remembered the coordinates. He said, "You're the one. You're the one we've been tracking, or documenting, or monitoring. We have different words for it depending on who's doing the talking and what part of they government they work for." "Tracking how?" I asked. "What do you mean tracking?" "The Forest Service keeps records," he said. "Not official records, not the kind that you can get through a FOIA request. Records kept by rangers who understand what we're dealing with. Informal records passed between people who work in the field and who have been exposed to the reality that the animals exist and that they're intelligent. When you reported that cub, it went into a special file. Your name got flagged. We tracked your movement between job sites over time. We knew you were marked when we found the tag in your truck 5 years later." "You went through my truck?" I said. A ranger knew exactly what he was looking for. He found the tag in your vehicle during a routine patrol of the parking area. He photographed it, and the photograph went into the file. You were put on a watch list. Not a threat list, not a monitor for violence or instability kind of list. A person of interest list. The kind of list that means if you encounter something, or if something happens to you, if you get injured, or if you go missing, or if you report something unusual, we know the context. We know why. We know the connection. We understand that you're part of a larger picture. How many other people are on this list? I asked. Hundreds, he said. Maybe thousands by now. Anyone who's reported direct contact with the animals. Anyone who's been marked by them. Anyone who fits the profile. The Forest Service knows. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service knows. Federal agencies know. It's not public. There's no official acknowledgement. The world isn't ready to acknowledge it, so the knowledge stays contained. The people who know live with it in silence. Why are you telling me this? I asked. Why break the silence? Because the situation is changing, he said. The animals are pushing for recognition. They're stepping into spaces where denial isn't possible anymore. Marked people are going to be the bridge between the world of humans and the world that's been hidden. The translators, whether we want to be or not, whether we're ready to be or not. The choice was made the day you picked up that cub. I sat with that for a long moment, trying to process the implications. Are you marked? I asked him. He didn't answer right away. He got up and walked to a window that looked out over the neighborhood. Trees in people's yards, a street with houses on it. The normal world. The world where the things we were talking about didn't exist. Yes, he said finally. I've been marked for 35 years. He told me more than I've shared publicly. I'm going to share some of it now, because the situation Robert described, the network of government awareness, the classified documentation, the decision to contain rather than disclose, is part of the full picture that I think you need to understand. Robert had been a ranger in the Umatilla National Forest and then in the Wallowa Whitman for over 3 decades. He had filed 8 separate incident reports over his career that had been classified at levels that prevented public access. Not routine classification, not the low-level administrative classification that applies to sensitive personal information or active investigations. Classification at a level that he had never encountered in any other context in his work, a level that indicated federal interest in preventing public access, rather than the ordinary process of protecting individual privacy or investigation integrity. He had, through channels I won't describe, accessed the summary documentation on 2 of those reports, his own reports. What he found was that the reports had been forwarded to a federal office he hadn't known existed, a small office within the Department of the Interior, with a name that described nothing about its actual function, and that appeared in no public organizational chart. The office had a physical address in Washington, D.C. It had a small staff, 9 people as of the most recent organizational documentation Robert had seen, and it had been in continuous operation since 1972, 50-plus years of continuous operation. Long before Robert's first report, long before any of the marked people's encounters, long before the public internet, and long before the kind of amateur documentation that now filled social media with footage and testimony and corroboration. The office had known since at least 1972. That was the implication of continuous operation, that someone in the federal government had established a dedicated institutional mechanism for managing knowledge about these animals at least 50 years ago, possibly longer, since institutional offices are often established after a period of informal management rather than before it. The informal management phase might have begun decades earlier. Might have begun when the first ranger or forester or wildlife biologist filed a report that didn't fit any known category, and someone in a position of authority made the decision that the knowledge should be contained rather than distributed. Why? I asked Robert. Why contain it? What's the rationale? He said he'd asked himself that question for 30 years, and had arrived at 3 possible answers, none mutually exclusive. The first was stability. Public knowledge of an unidentified, highly intelligent bipedal canine species operating in North American forests would produce fear, hunting pressure, political conflict, the kind of social instability that governments exist partly to prevent. The second was strategic advantage. An entity with detailed knowledge about a hidden intelligent species had an informational advantage worth protecting. The third was uncertainty. No one had figured out the right policy response, what rights these animals had or didn't have, what obligations humans had toward them. In the absence of policy consensus, the default was containment. What do you think the right answer is? I asked him. He looked at the window for a long time. I think the right answer changes depending on who's asking, he said. The right answer for a government managing 300 million people is different from the right answer for someone who's been carrying a brass tag for 20 years and wants to know what it means. He paused. I think we're running out of time. I think the animals have decided that the timeline isn't ours anymore. There's a specific kind of grief that comes with the relief of being told you're not alone in something. I wasn't prepared for it. I thought being told that the knowledge was real, that other people carried it, that a network existed, would be purely a relief. And there was relief in it. enormous immediate relief, the kind that loosens something in your chest that you'd forgotten was tight because it had been tight for so long that the tightness had become your baseline. 20 years of carrying something alone. And then someone telling you, with specificity and credibility, that you had never actually been alone in it. But underneath the relief was the grief. The specific grief of 20 years that could have been different. 20 years of isolation that turned out to have been, at least in part, a choice made by others on my behalf. Not maliciously, not with indifference to the cost, but chosen nonetheless. And I had not been the one who got to choose. I had carried the isolation because I had been positioned to carry it by a system that had decided my isolated observation was more useful than my participation in the network would have been, and I hadn't known. For 20 years I hadn't known, and the not knowing had shaped me, had shaped what I paid attention to, and how I paid attention to it, and what I became in the years of that particular kind of aloneness. I've made peace with it. I want to be clear about that. I understand the reasoning. I understand that an observer who knows they're being observed changes their observation. That my 20 years of naive documentation, honest and unguided and free from the influence of a community that had its own theories and frameworks and interpretive habits, might genuinely have been more valuable than 20 years of integrated membership in the network would have been. I understand that the people who made that choice, assuming it was a choice and not simply an institutional failure to reach me, had their reasons. I understand the reasons and I've made peace with them. But the grief is still there underneath the peace, and I think it will always be there. Some losses don't stop being losses just because you can explain why they happened. What the network gave me eventually was language. The thing I had been missing for 20 years was not information exactly. I had information. I had observations. What I didn't have was words, a vocabulary for what I was observing that was adequate to its actual nature. The language that ordinary wildlife biology had given me was insufficient. It was a grammar built for known categories, and what I was experiencing operated outside those categories. The network had been building a different vocabulary, slowly, collectively, through the accumulated experience of hundreds of people who had each been working on the same problem from different angles. Claim markers, presentation calls, reciprocity windows, watch cycles, territory integration. These terms, and others like them, had been developed by marked people trying to describe specific phenomena they had observed, giving language to experiences that existing language had no adequate terms for. They weren't scientific terminology in the formal sense. They hadn't been peer-reviewed. They hadn't emerged from controlled observation with replicable methodology. But they were accurate in the way that terms are accurate when they've been developed by people who actually experienced the thing they're trying to name, who worked backward from experience to language rather than forward from theory to expectation. They described what was actually happening rather than what should theoretically be happening based on known biology. Learning that vocabulary felt, at first, like being handed a dictionary in a language you'd been thinking in for decades without knowing the words. Like the concepts had been there all along, clear and specific in your experience, and you'd just been unable to say them. The first time I read the phrase reciprocity window in a network post and understood immediately what it meant, recognized it as describing something I had experienced without having been able to name, I sat with my laptop for a long time doing nothing, just sitting with the relief of a word that fit. The network also gave me scale. I had experienced my encounter as a series of singular events, unique to me and my specific geography. The network showed me that the pattern was not singular, that it recurred across regions, across decades, across the full range of the animal's territory, that hundreds of people had experienced variations of the same fundamental encounter, the injured juvenile, the choice to help, the marking, the subsequent observation, and object leaving and occasional direct contact. The animals were doing this deliberately finding humans who showed kindness to injured juveniles and incorporating them into a long-term observation and relationship system. This was a practice, a cultural practice possibly, if you were willing to use that language for what these animals did. Understanding that changed the weight of what I carried. Not lighter exactly, but differently distributed. It happened when I was young, when I first started working as a ranger. I found something injured. I helped it. I didn't understand at the time what the implications would be. I didn't understand that helping a creature change your place in the world permanently, but I understand now. I understand that I made a choice that created an obligation that spans decades and will span the rest of my life. I understand that there are things in the forest that know my face and remember my actions and have made decisions about me based on that history. I haven't been back to see him since. I don't know if he's still alive, but what he said has stuck with me. The bridge between worlds, marked as a translator, A person who has been seen and recognized and assigned a role in something much larger than I ever intended. And now, in 2024, 20 years after the original incident, something new has started, something accelerated and intentional. Marked people are being contacted more directly. Not through objects or observation or the subtle presence that characterized the first 15 years of contact, but through direct communication, emails, letters, phone calls in some cases, requests for interviews, requests for detailed accounts, people claiming to represent a branch of government that studies these animals, people who want to know what I know, what I've observed over 2 decades, what I understand about the animal's behavior and intelligence and social structure, people who want access to the market people, who want to build a database, who want to create some kind of network or directory of individuals who have been seen and recognized and integrated into the world of the watchers. I haven't responded to any of these contact attempts, not through email, not through phone, not through any channel that would confirm my location or my willingness to participate. But I know they're real because other marked people have reported receiving similar contact attempts. There's a consensus forming among the marked community that the old world of silence and denial is ending, that governments have known about these animals for decades, possibly longer, that research programs exist that the public doesn't know about, that classified files contain data and observations that would fundamentally change how we understand the world, that there's a protocol being developed for eventual public disclosure, something that the government is trying to prepare for while simultaneously trying to prevent panic. The tag sits on my desk in a small wooden box. Sarah, 1987. Scratched and re-scratched with the marks of something with significant bite force and intelligence. A claim marker, a thing that was claimed, a thing that was passed along. A history I don't fully understand and don't know if I ever will understand. And I wear it sometimes, especially when I'm in the forest doing field work or teaching or just spending time in the wild places where I still feel most alive. I wear it because I understand what it means now. I'm marked, I'm watched, I'm protected by something that has decided I'm worth watching over. And I'm part of something that's emerging into visibility after decades of being hidden. Something that's starting to force itself into the awareness of the world, whether the world is ready or not. The cub is an adult now. It's been 20 years since I found it injured under a fallen tree. 2 decades is enough time for that animal to have matured, to have found its place in whatever society or hierarchy these animals have, to have possibly reproduced and raised offspring of its own. It might be in a leadership position in whatever structure these animals maintain. It might be old enough to be responsible for the increased visibility in the last few years, the shift toward contact, the deliberate appearance in front of witnesses. It might be pushing for recognition, for acknowledgement, for the end of denial. It might be making the decision that hiding is no longer viable or necessary. Or it might simply be living its life in the forest the way that all animals live their lives, hunting, protecting territory, raising young, continuing the pattern that's been established over generations, doing what its species does, following the rules that govern its kind. I don't know. I've thought about this for 20 years, and I've never come to a definitive conclusion. But I know that if I encounter it again, assuming I survive long enough for another encounter, it will recognize me. It will know that I gave it water when it was hurt, that I held it when it was suffering, that I made a choice to show kindness to something that suffered and was impossible and didn't fit into the world I thought I understood. And that action, that small kindness, that choice to help something suffering, changed me, made me known, made me marked, made me part of something larger than my own life and my own understanding. And I know that the forest remembers, the watchers remember, the marked people remember, the tag remembers. Every scratch on that metal surface is a record of something. Every gouged line is a memory encoded into brass. And the boundary between what's possible and what's not is getting thinner every day. Eventually, it's going to break completely. The world is going to understand that something intelligent has been living alongside us the whole time. Something that hunts, something that thinks, something that chooses. And when that moment comes, people like me, marked people, the ones who have been seen and recognized and integrated into a system that operates underneath the surface of normal wildlife, we're going to be the ones standing between panic and understanding. We're going to be the translators. We're going to be the bridge. I'm still here. I'm still teaching. I'm still working in the forest. I'm still carrying the tag and thinking about Sarah and 1987 and what those marks mean. The Dogman is still out there. The watchers are still watching. The marked community continues to grow. And 20 years after picking up an injured cub, everything is still guarding. Everything is still watching. Everything is still building towards something. The line between worlds is thinning, and I'm waiting to see what happens when it finally breaks. The spread of knowledge through the marked community accelerated dramatically in 2023 and 2024. Information that had been contained within informal networks started to become more visible. More people started talking openly about being marked, about the objects that had been left for them, about the encounters that had shaped their lives. I started receiving direct contact from government agencies around mid-2023, phone calls from blocked numbers, callers introducing themselves with official-sounding titles but never clear agency names. Federal Research Specialist, Biological Survey Coordinator, Department of Interior Consultant. A man showed up at my work site in the fall of 2023, dressed in casual outdoor clothing, but carrying himself with the specific precision and alertness of someone trained in law enforcement or intelligence work. He asked casually if I had documented any significant wildlife encounters recently. Very casual, very conversational, but specifically fishing for information from someone he had flagged in a database. I said nothing to him. I politely declined to engage, but I understood the message. The government was starting to openly reach out to marked people, starting to position itself to manage the situation that was coming. I began keeping detailed journals of every marked person I could contact through the encrypted forums and the anonymous channels where we communicate. The network grew. By the middle of 2024, I was in direct contact with maybe 40 marked people, 40 individuals who had experienced variations of what I had experienced, who had found objects, who had been observed and tracked over years, who had made the choice to help something suffering, and had been marked for that choice. 40 was just my network. Margaret had a network of maybe 60 in California and Oregon. Robert had known hundreds across his decades in the Forest Service. The marks were spreading. The awareness was spreading. The knowledge that something intelligent was living in parallel with human civilization was spreading through the subset of humanity that had experienced direct contact, and the animals kept pushing for visibility. The 2023 encounter at Mount Jefferson was just one of many public appearances that year. By late 2024, there were dozens of clear videos, some clearly authentic, filmed by people with professional camera equipment and documentary experience, some poorly faked, obvious hoaxes, but enough authentic documentation that denial was becoming impossible, enough corroboration that scientific institutions were starting to take it seriously, starting to fund research, starting to publicly fund research, not just secret research hidden in classified files. Universities started offering courses. Cryptozoology programs started appearing in biology and wildlife management departments. The discourse shifted from, "These animals don't exist," to, "How should we study these animals?" The tipping point arrived faster than I expected. The final part of this story is the part that terrifies me most. Because the final part is the unknowability of it. I don't know what the government is going to do when they have enough data to publicly confirm the existence of the Watchers. Will it be a formal announcement? A leaked document? Gradual acknowledgement? I don't know what the public is going to do when they understand that the Watchers exist and are intelligent. Will there be panic, hunting expeditions, protection efforts? I don't know what the Watchers themselves want at the end of this process, what their ultimate goal is, what the endgame looks like, and the uncertainty is something I carry every day. But I know that I'm part of it. I know that picking up an injured cub 20 years ago changed the trajectory of my life. I know that giving it water and shelter and safety created a connection that spans 20 years and has reshaped everything. I know that wearing the tag made me visible to something intelligent and patient and powerful. And I know that whatever comes next, I'll be standing at the intersection of two worlds: the world of humans, the world of the Watchers, the world of the marked people who exist between them. I'm still here. I'm still teaching wilderness medicine and safety. I'm still working in the forest. I'm still carrying the tag. I still wear it sometimes. I still think about Sarah in 1987 and what those marks mean. The Dogman is still out there. The Watchers are still watching. The mark community continues to grow as more people encounter these animals and make the choice to show kindness rather than fear. And 20 years after picking up an injured cub, everything is still guarding, everything is still watching, everything is still remembering, everything is still building towards something massive, something undeniable, something that will change how humanity understands itself and its place in the world. The line between worlds is thinning. The boundary is fracturing, and I'm waiting to see what happens when it finally breaks completely. The Mount Jefferson encounter in 2023 deserves more detail than I gave it earlier. That encounter changed something for me, changed the way I understood my role in this emerging reality. Let me go back to that day and describe it properly. It was late August, the light was starting to shift toward that particular quality that late summer has, where everything is still warm during the day, but there's an undertone of chill in the shadows. We had hiked for about 6 hours when we came around that switchback. My class was 12 people, ranging from a nursing student in her 20s to a retired physician in his 70s. All of them were there because they wanted to understand how to provide medical care in wilderness situations when you're far from hospitals, and evacuation might take hours. We came around the switchback and the Dogman was there, standing on the trail, not to the side of the trail, not partially concealed, directly on the trail, occupying the center of the path, standing upright in the classic Dogman posture, 7 feet tall, maybe slightly more. The afternoon light was directly hitting it, illuminating the form completely. There was no ambiguity. There was no possibility of misidentification. There was a large bipedal canine creature standing directly in front of 12 witnesses, in full daylight, in a space where there was nowhere for it to hide. What happened next was the thing that changed my understanding of everything. The 12 people in my group stopped. They had seen it, all 12 of them. Some reached for phones, some froze. One woman made a sound, a small gasp, a vocalization of shock. The younger people started to move forward, but something in the animal's bearing stopped them. The creature was perfectly still, not aggressive, not posturing, just standing there, allowing itself to be observed. Then it looked at me. Not at the group, not at a random person, at me specifically. Its head moved slightly and its gaze locked on me. And I felt something pass between us, a recognition, an acknowledgement, a confirmation that what I had done 20 years ago had been remembered, that the cub had survived, that the connection that had been established had endured, that I was being marked again, confirmed again, recognized again in front of witnesses. The dog's snout opened slightly and it made a sound, not a bark, not a growl, a vocalization that was somewhere between a whimper and a groan, but deeper, more resonant. A sound that carried intent and emotion, and I understood that sound. I understood that the creature was saying something to me, something that wasn't for the others, something private, something that acknowledged what I had done. Then it turned and walked back into the forest, calmly, not running, not panicked, walking with the deliberate pace of something that was exactly where it wanted to be and was leaving exactly when it chose to leave. In seconds, it was gone. The trail was empty. The forest had absorbed it. The group was silent. Nobody spoke for maybe a full minute. Then people started asking questions. What was that? Did we just see what I think we saw? Did anyone film it? Someone had filmed it. One of the nursing students had gotten video on her phone. The video was shaky and it captured maybe 3 seconds of clear footage, but it was undeniable. The video went viral within a week. It got millions of views. It became the most compelling Dogman footage ever captured. But here's the thing that nobody else knows. Here's the thing that only I know. That Dogman was looking at me. It appeared to you because I was there. It showed itself to prove something to me. It was saying, I remember. I survived. I'm grateful. I'm watching you. And I'm making sure you're recognized. That's when I understood my role fully. I wasn't just a marked person. I was a link. I was a bridge. I was the connection point between the world of humans and the world of the Watchers. And my job was going to be to help humanity understand what was coming, to prepare people, to be the translator when the full acknowledgement came. That's when I started talking more openly about my experience. That's when I stopped hiding completely. I became more active in the marked person networks. I started writing about what I had observed. I started speaking to the journalists and researchers who were starting to study this phenomenon seriously. I became part of the public documentation of something that humanity had been denying for centuries. And I understood that this was the choice the cub had made for me. 20 years ago, when I picked it up and gave it water and shelter, it made a decision about who I was going to be. It marked me as someone who shows kindness, someone who helps, someone who can bridge worlds, someone who can be trusted with knowledge that most people aren't ready for. I'm still here, 20 years later, 21 years now, still carrying the tag, still wearing it sometimes, still teaching, still documenting, still waiting for the moment when the entire world understands what I already know. That we share this planet with something intelligent, something powerful, something that has been watching us with patience and with interest and with a system of reciprocity that we are only beginning to comprehend. The Watchers are still there. The Dogman is still out there. The marked people are still emerging into visibility. And the story is far from over. It's just beginning. The real story is just beginning. What I'm trying to tell you by sharing this story is that the world is changing. The barrier between what we thought was possible and what's actually happening is collapsing. The knowledge that was hidden is becoming visible. The creatures that were myths are proving to be real. And the people who have been marked, who have been chosen by the Watchers, we are becoming important. We are becoming central to how humanity is going to process this transition. I don't know if you're marked. I don't know if you've had an encounter. But if you're watching this, you might encounter something. You might find something injured in the forest. You might make the choice that I made 20 years ago. And if you do, you should understand what that choice means. You're creating a connection, you're being observed. You're being integrated into a system of reciprocity that spans decades and possibly centuries. It will change your life. It will mark you, make you known, make you part of something larger than yourself. That's a profound thing, a sacred thing, even if you don't use religious language. The tag sits on my desk, Sarah, 1987. I will never fully understand what it means. I will never know who Sarah was or what happened to her or why her name is encoded on that brass. But I carry her story anyway. The mark is a reminder that there are things we don't know. There are connections that span decades and involve people we'll never meet, and lives we'll never fully understand. But they matter. All of it matters. The forest is more than trees and trails and wildlife. The forest is a space where different worlds touch, where humans and something else can meet and exchange, where kindness to a suffering creature can echo across 20 years and reshape everything. I am the translator now. I am the bridge. If you encounter something, if you make the choice that I made, you might become a translator too. You might become marked. You might become known. You might become part of the story that's unfolding right now. The Dogman is still out there, still guarding, still watching, still remembering. And 20 years after giving water to an injured cub, I'm still here, still carrying the mark, still waiting. When the hidden becomes visible, when the world understands what I already know, the tag remembers, the forest remembers, the Watchers remember, and soon humanity will remember too. There's something I haven't told you yet about what it's like to be marked, what it's like to carry this knowledge for 20 years, what it's like to be the person who knows something that most people think is impossible. The isolation is real. The isolation is profound. You can't talk to most people about what you know because you'll immediately be categorized as unreliable or crazy or attention-seeking. You learn to compartmentalize. You learn to have two versions of yourself. The public version that talks about normal wildlife and normal forest management, and the private version that knows about the Watchers. That carries the weight of understanding something that changes everything. The dreams are different too. There's a quality to dreams after you've been marked. Sometimes I dream that I'm still in that motel room holding the injured cub. Sometimes I dream that I'm standing in a vast forest and there are hundreds of Watchers, all of them watching me, all of them waiting. Sometimes I dream that I'm finally finding Sarah, finding out who she was and what happened to her. There's a physical component too. My body knows things that my conscious mind hasn't processed. There are places in the forest where I feel a shift in my nervous system, a recognition, a settling, as if something in me is aligning with something in the environment. The marked people think differently. We notice things. We see patterns. We understand the forest in a way that most people don't. We recognize signs and signals and meanings that are invisible to people who haven't been marked. We develop intuitions that are sometimes unsettling in their accuracy. I've become good at predicting when something is going to happen in the forest. When Watchers are nearby, when marking activity is occurring, when the boundary between worlds is thinning. That ability, that intuition, has made me valuable to the government people. That's part of why they're reaching out. They want to harness what marked people know. They want to use our connections to the Watchers to build bridges, to establish communication protocols, to create frameworks for eventual coexistence. I'm not sure I want that. I'm not sure marked people should be conscripted into service to government objectives. But I don't know how to opt out. I don't know if opting out is even possible. The marking doesn't come with an instruction manual. You just have to live with it and try to understand it and do your best to use it wisely. What I know now, 20 years later, is that helping the cub was the right choice. Even knowing the isolation and the burden and the weight of it. I would make the same choice again, because that's what being marked means. It means being someone who sees suffering and doesn't look away. It means making the choice to be kind even when it costs you something. It means being willing to help something that doesn't fit. That's who I am now. That's what the mark means. And if that has to be part of the story of how humanity transitions into a new understanding of the world, then so be it. Then I'll be that person. I'll be the translator. I'll be the bridge. I'll be the one who looks the Watchers in the eye and remembers. I'll be the one who carries the story, who wears the tag, who understands. The cub became an adult. The adult became a guardian. The guardian led the shift toward visibility. The visibility brought the world to the edge of understanding. And I was the one holding the bridge, the one standing between, The one who knew what was possible because I had already lived it. That's my story. That's what the tag means. That's what 20 years of being marked has taught me. And that's what I'm passing on to you. That's what I want you to understand. That's what I need you to know when the world finally changes and the hidden becomes visible. Be kind to what suffers. Show mercy to what's impossible. Help the creatures that don't fit. Because you never know when you're going to be marked by something greater than yourself. You never know when a choice made in a forest is going to reshape your entire existence. You never know when you're going to become a translator between worlds. But when it happens, when you feel the mark, when you understand that you've been chosen, know that you're not alone. There's a community. There are hundreds of us who have made the same choice. And there's a larger intelligence watching and building towards something that we're all part of. And I'll be here, still in the forest, still carrying the tag, still remembering the cub, still waiting for the day when everything changes.